Patreon is in crisis. It's in a financial crisis, but also an identity crisis, one which risks undermining some of its most fundamental founding principles. And I think both Patreon creators and their supporters should be pretty concerned. Let me explain. About 6 months ago, I received an email from Patreon, which makes me sound way more important than I am. It was actually just a mailing list email which was sent, presumably, to every creator with a Patreon page. Nevertheless, I received an email which was sent from Patreon to me, among others. The email revealed that Patreon was going to be removing the goals feature from creators' pages. For the unacquainted, this was a function which allowed creators to set a series of targets, either for how much money they were receiving each month or how many total supporters they had on the platform. And it always seemed to be a relatively popular feature. Many used it as a way to incentivize more signups by promising to make particular in-demand bits of content only after crossing certain milestones. This Big Joel video about Click? That was a Patreon goal. As were these. The decision to remove such a useful, popular feature was a bit of a shock, but it was their rationale for doing so which really caught my attention. To quote that email, which was sent personally to me, goals were originally intended to help creators grow their pages, but we found only 4.5% of creators with in-progress goals were gaining more patrons. Let me repeat that last bit for you. Only 4.5% of creators with in-progress goals were gaining more patrons. It fascinates me that this figure didn't come under more scrutiny at the time. There are several channels which report on the so-called creator economy, which I would have expected to have been all over this. But hey, I guess Colin and Samir needed to make another video about how Mr. Beast is cool that week. Trawling the internet, the most I could find about this was a single tweet from Patrick Willems and a Reddit thread with less than 35 upvotes. Either no one had noticed or no one dared talk about the obvious implications of that 4.5% figure. That Patreon might not be in the rudest of health. The long and the short of it is that it's not. After years of mind-boggling growth, a sudden stagnation in the number of new creators and supporters joining the site has shaken Patreon to its core. Worse still, the panic this crisis appears to have provoked in the company's investors and management has prompted the rollout of sweeping changes to the platform, which not only risk exacerbating that crisis, but ultimately undermining Patreon's founding mission of enabling creators to make a living from their work. This video has been a tricky one to make. I like Patreon. I think it is a good service at its core, and that its impact on the online creative landscape has overall been a massively positive one. But to truly understand the magnitude of the crisis that Patreon is facing and the difficulty of finding a way out of it, we need to understand the journey the company's been on so far. The story of Patreon is one of creators and creativity, yes, but it's also one of vanity, venture capital investment, and stock valuations. At its heart, it's something of a morality tale about how profit-oriented investors can corrupt even the most exciting ideas. Come with me then and witness the rise and fall of Patreon.
Thank you so much to my Patreon supporters who make this possible.
And if you are a patron of Easy Allies, thanks.
And thank you especially to all of my supporters on Patreon.
I suggest becoming a patron.
Don't thank us, thank our patrons.
All that remains is for me to thank my top tier Patreon supporters.
On the 7th of May 2013, Jack Conte uploaded this video to his YouTube channel. It's a music video for his then latest song, Pedals, which is, for the record, an absolute banger. All the lyrics are taken from the names of the many, many effects pedals in Conte's music studio, and it features 2 separate motorized robots. Nevertheless, the video is less notable for the song itself than for what comes after it. After the credits roll, Conte explains that he and a friend, Sam Yam, have just launched a website called Patreon.
It's like a Kickstarter for people who release stuff on a regular basis instead of people who are just concentrating on one thing, like a movie or an album. It's for the thousands of content creators now, tens of thousands, who have this beautiful, prolific output, and it's for them. It's for us.
Now, this was a pretty bold way to describe Patreon as it then existed. Far from tens of thousands of creators, at this point it featured just 3. Conte himself, his girlfriend Natalie Dawn, and their roommate Lauren O'Connell. But it reflected well the ambition he had for the site. According to company law, Conte had come up with the idea for Patreon the previous January. By this point, he was already a pretty successful creator, with a sizable following on YouTube for both his band, Pomplamoose, and his solo career. But the finances of it all weren't really adding up.
So this is an actual snapshot of my YouTube dashboard from a 28-day period that shows 1 million views and $166 of ad earnings for those views.
Of course, the reason that Jack Conte is on the TED stage here is that he wasn't the only creative type struggling to balance the books in the mid-2010s. This was an industry-wide problem. The internet had made it possible for artists, writers, musicians, and other creatives to build global fan bases without needing the approval of the corporate gatekeepers in their respective industries. But few had managed to turn this online popularity into an income. A strange scenario existed where it was possible to have a sizable, passionate following and yet still be struggling to pay the rent. By 2013, the idea that creatives might solicit funding directly from fans had been around for some time. Kickstarter and Indiegogo had both played host to some pretty significant creative success stories. Jack Conte's real innovation was to note that whilst these sites worked well for one-off projects like an album or film, most online creators didn't work on that kind of staccato, one project then the next basis. They were constantly releasing stuff. So he wondered, what if you took that crowdfunding concept and rebuilt it around a monthly subscription model? It's no exaggeration to say that Patreon was a pretty instant hit. Just weeks after uploading that music video, Jack Conte had accumulated pledges of more than $5,000.
Within 2 weeks of launching, I was making 6 figures as a creative person. Like, within 2 weeks of putting up a Patreon, I didn't change my videos, I didn't change my music, I didn't change my anything. I just put up a Patreon page.
Far from finding it cheeky or crass, fans seem to be genuinely enthusiastic about helping to financially support the content they loved. Unsurprisingly, as news of Conte's impressive sign-up stats began to spread, more and more creators were tempted to try Patreon out. 3 creators became 6, which became 15, which became 50, which became 100, until just after 6 months post-launch, Patreon was helping thousands of creators fund their creative ambitions. Okay, so far, so heartwarming. The story of Patreon's founding is undoubtedly a pretty charming one. Compare it to that of YouTube, which was dreamt up to make it easier for its founders to find footage of Janet Jackson's famous Super Bowl wardrobe malfunction. Or Facebook, which grew out of a website for college students to rank their peers based on perceived hotness. Patreon's origins, by contrast, are just so wholesome. The fact that Jack Conte, who remains Patreon's CEO to this day, is also a creator himself, lends a real sense of authenticity to the platform. Now, there's no doubting Conte's creative credentials, but it's worth recognizing that Patreon is ultimately a Silicon Valley startup founded by 2 Stanford graduates. And despite attempts to distance itself from the Metas and Googles of this world, it's often followed a pretty similar path to those less well-loved companies. In fact, if we wanted to isolate an inciting incident for Patreon's present crisis, it would lie in Jack Conte and his co-founder Sam Yam's decision just 2 months after Patreon went live to negotiate $700,000 in investment from a venture capital firm named Freestyle Ventures. For the uninitiated, venture capital, or VC funding, is a form of business financing, popular amongst Silicon Valley startups. How it works is that a venture capital firm will provide a startup with a chunk of money in return for an ownership stake in that company. In the ideal scenario, the company will use that money to grow, at which stage they will solicit more VC money, and more, until when that company has proven itself a success, it will be floated on the stock exchange, allowing the VC firms to sell their shares at a massive profit. Conte and Yam have consistently and enthusiastically embraced this strategy. By the time Patreon was 3 months old, it had raised $2.1 million in investment, primarily from venture capital firms. And this quickly became something of a habit. Over the next 8 years, they would raise a total of $410 million in this way. Whether or not Patreon would have been able to revolutionize the creator economy in the way that it has without this kind of investment remains an open question. There's no doubt that building the company to the scale that it is today required some capital. But at the same time, the company has always managed to grow pretty organically. The beauty of the product is that the more creators that sign up and start promoting their Patreon pages, the more other creators hear about it and sign up too. Either way, Conte and Yam's decision to hand over so much equity to such single-mindedly profit-oriented investors would eventually come to threaten many of their platform's founding ideals. But before the fall, the rise. Because whatever Patreon's present failings, its successes are staggering. In just a few short years, the model of subscription crowdfunding the platform is built upon went from being completely unheard of to a central force in the creator economy. It wasn't a foregone conclusion that Patreon would be the sole dominant player in this. Early on, it had several competitors. The most notable of these was a site called Subbable, which had been launched by Hank and John Green just 2 months after Patreon, and which worked on a very similar basis. It would take regular donations from fans and distribute them to creators. The Green brothers, however, took a much more cautious approach to growth. For various reasons, Subbable remained invite-only, with creators having to apply to join. The benefit of this was that it allowed Subbable to build a sense of prestige around its select roster of popular YouTubers. The downside was that it allowed Patreon, which had enabled anyone to create a profile from day one, to gather a momentum which Subbable simply couldn't match. By the time Subbable had onboarded 24 creators, Patreon had over 10,000. The result was that Patreon was everywhere. Even the most casual YouTube viewer or podcast listener had at least some idea of what it meant for a creator to have a Patreon page, and what it meant to be a patron of someone. In fact, Patreon often felt less like a platform or company than a cultural phenomenon. The platform's ultimate victory was secured in March 2015, when Jack Conte announced that Patreon had bought Subbable for an undisclosed amount. In doing so, it had established an effective monopoly on subscription crowdfunding. Other competitors like Ko-fi limped on, but their relative footprint was pretty tiny. All of this was surely cause for celebration among Patreon's staff and investors. But its impact on creators would be mixed. Patreon had changed the game and made vast swathes of creativity possible, which otherwise might have simply been financially inviable. Nevertheless, the lack of any meaningful competition placed many creators' livelihoods entirely in its hands. Okay, so I want to fast forward a bit here to January 2019 and show you this headline. It reads, Patreon's CEO says the company's generous business model is not sustainable as it sees rapid growth. This headline was the result of an interview that Jack Conte had given to CNBC, in which he'd claimed that the company would need to make significant changes to its pricing structure if it was going to remain profitable. This was an intriguing statement. At the time, Patreon was on top of the world, with 128,000 creators using the site. In fact, according to that same article, Patreon was on track to process $500 million in pledges that year. Given that, at the time, it took a flat 5% cut of all pledges after processing fees, this would have given it a total revenue of $25 million after the cost of processing payments had already been taken into account. Which, given that processing payments is the main thing it does, of course, few would bemoan Patreon making enough money to pay its staff and turn a profit. But remember those venture capitalists from earlier? By 2019, Patreon had raised $105 million in investment, much of it from VC firms. And venture capitalists are rarely content with a bit of profit. The risky nature of their investments means that they need those which are successful to be really successful. The industry rule of thumb is that a successful startup should provide a return of 10 times the initial investment. Profitability for Patreon meant turning that $100 million into $1 billion. Signs that this might impact Patreon's relationship with creators first emerged as early as 2017. When the company posted this update to its official blog. The update revealed plans to shift the burden of processing fees from creators to their fans. While this would supposedly have saved creators some money on the back end, it involved supporters being charged an additional 35 cents plus 2.9% in fees on top of every pledge. The backlash to this announcement was brutal. Creators turned on Patreon, complaining that the fixed portion of the fee specifically stood to disproportionately impact smaller backers, some of whom for which it meant a nearly 40% price hike. More than this, it just seemed to go against the culture of the site, pushing creators away from drumming up lots of smaller donations and towards soliciting fewer but much larger pledges. After 6 days of creators threatening to leave the platform and fans cancelling pledges, the changes were scrapped, with Jack Conte forced to personally apologise for the fumbled rollout. But concern among investors that Patreon was being too generous in setting its fees didn't go away. 2 months after that 29 CNBC headline then, Patreon came back with a new proposal. Rather than hiking prices for fans, it would instead increase the percentage it took from creators. Where the company had previously claimed a flat 5% after processing fees, it would now offer multiple plans. A no-frills light plan would continue to be charged at 5%. A so-called pro plan, which closely mirrored the previous offering, would be charged at 8%. Finally, a premium plan, aimed at larger creators, would be charged at 12%. These fee hikes were, in many ways, far more brazen than those which had been proposed previously. Nevertheless, the company managed to avoid a mass exodus by grandfathering in existing creators on what it called its founder plan, which remained at 5%. Obviously, there was still some risk that this new pricing structure would deter new creators from joining the platform. But events were about to conspire to turn any predictions about Patreon's future on their heads. Alright, let's do this one last time. On the final day of 2019, the World Health Organization received reports of 44 unexplained cases of pneumonia in Wuhan, China. By February, the infection that had caused those cases had a name: COVID-19. And by March, cities, towns and villages across the world had gone silent as quarantine and lockdown restrictions confined people to their homes. These were bleak times. A lot of people were scared for both their health and their jobs. But at the same time, folks had a lot of time on their hands, which meant two things for the creator economy. First, a lot more people sat at home looking for stuff to watch, read or listen to. And second, a whole bunch of folks who now had the time to explore their own creative ambitions. The result for Patreon was a huge influx of both creators and supporters. Over the previous 12 months, Patreon's growth had been dwindling. But in just the first 3 weeks of March 2020, more than 30,000 creators joined the platform. Fans responded with almost 1 million new pledges. The COVID-19 pandemic almost served as a second launch for Patreon. It led to a whole new wave of creators discovering the site and benefiting from the unique relationship it enabled them to develop with their fans. For some, it provided a crucial slither of income during trying economic times. For others, it provided a whole new career path. But remember those venture capitalists from earlier? In September 2020, Jack Conte uploaded another update to his YouTube channel.
Patreon just raised 90 million bucks. Woohoo! This is super exciting.
This new round of investment pushed the company's valuation to $1.2 billion. Then, less than a year later, Conte uploaded another video.
Patreon just raised $150 million Series F round of financing at a $4 billion valuation.
That's right. Patreon was now supposedly worth $4 billion. Suddenly, Jack Conte was everywhere again, hailed on podcasts and at conferences as the man who was shepherding creators into a new era of prosperity.
Okay, let's try this. We're gonna just repeat after me. Ha! Okay, now try this. Yes!
This characterization was very much of his own creation. He repeatedly claimed that his company being worth $4 billion was the sign of a coming second renaissance.
There's a feedback loop that started a couple years ago that's now cycling on itself faster and faster, and I believe it's gonna lead to an explosion in creativity.
Back at Patreon itself, the exec team were preparing for world domination. They poached a new chief product officer from Instagram, who first fired a bunch of staff and then announced a massive hiring push, which he predicted would see the company double in size by the end of the year. And then, well, the worst stage of the pandemic subsided. People were allowed to leave their houses and see their friends again. That massive surge in creators and pledges turned out not to be the start of a new era, but the result of a very specific set of circumstances which had now passed. And for a company which had now absorbed more than $400 million in investment, that was going to be a problem. Since the end of lockdown restrictions, Patreon's growth has slowed massively. For 4 of the 5 years between 2016 and 2021, the total number of pledges processed through the platform had grown more than 60% year on year. By the end of 2022, that number had dropped to just 7.5%. Of course, in a sane world, this wouldn't necessarily be bad news. The platform at least was still growing after all, just at a much lesser rate. Companies can't grow forever, and this should be okay. But remember those venture capitalists from earlier? That final set of VC firms had bought into Patreon at a valuation of $4 billion. But stagnating growth quickly made that number look laughable. In September 2022, Patreon Senior Vice President Carlos Cabrera sent a memo to staff revealing that Patreon's valuation had dropped a staggering 70%. The company swiftly laid off 17% of its workforce and closed whole offices in Dublin and Berlin. And here's where things get worrying for Patreon creators and their fans. Because the VC firms which bought into Patreon will still want growth. And if growth isn't likely to come from increasing the number of people using the site, it's ultimately going to have to come from increasing the amount of money that Patreon makes from the creators and fans who are already there. At this point, we need to return to those reconfigured creator plans from 2019, which were born of a previous era of stagnation for Patreon. Because, on reflection, they're kind of exploitative. See, when most businesses grow, they can usually expect to benefit from what are called economies of scale. If you're an artist who wants to sell t-shirts with your designs on them, it's generally much cheaper per unit to get 100 t-shirts printed than it is to print 10. This means that the larger your business grows, the more profit that you're able to keep per unit that you sell. Patreon's creator plans flip this on its head. The Lite plan has since been discontinued, meaning that small to medium-sized creators are most likely to sign up to the Pro tier. This will see them charged an 8% platform fee on all pledges. But if they grow to have a sizable number of supporters, then they might find it useful to have access to a Patreon partner manager or multiple admin accounts for different members of their team. By signing up to the premium plan, however, these creators not only end up paying more to Patreon through having more pledges for Patreon to take a cut of, but also paying a higher commission per pledge. My point here isn't to elicit a grand wave of sympathy for creators who are making huge sums through Patreon. Although I'm sure it's frustrating if you've got a team and bills to pay. I'm more interested in what this tells us about Patreon's business model. Take a look at this graph, which I made using data from Graphtreon. It plots descending percentiles of the 222,126 creators who have at least one public supporter on Patreon against the percentage of the total number of pledges which those percentiles receive. As you can see, the distribution is so skewed that you can barely even see the plot. If we crunch the numbers themselves, we find that, as of April 2023, more than 25% of public pledges processed through Patreon went to just 556 creators. That's just 0.25% of the total creator pool. More than 50% of pledges went to the top 1.75%. In fact, the bottom 80% of creators received just 10% of all pledges. Now, none of this is Patreon's fault. Neither is it much of a surprise. Audiences have always tended to agglomerate around a relatively small number of artists and creatives. But it does explain that seemingly backward approach to the pricing of Patreon's creator plans. Despite the impressive top-line figures which Jack Conte loves to quote about the total number of creators using the site, Patreon is actually heavily reliant on just a few thousand top earners. And there are signs that its business model going forward is likely to focus more and more on extracting a larger chunk of cash from those creators. The blogger and author Cory Doctorow likes to talk of what he calls the Enshittification of online platforms. Enshittification refers to a kind of mission creep which seems to affect all profit-oriented platforms at some stage in time. It happened to Facebook, to Instagram, and is currently happening to X too. In the broadest possible terms, Enshittification describes the process through which platforms pivot their attention away from providing a useful, reliable service for their users and towards ensuring a strong return on investment for their shareholders. This usually takes place through the introduction of a stream of new features, which, rather than serving to improve the offer which initially drew users to a site, instead exists solely to increase revenue. This has certainly been in evidence at Patreon over the past few years, where a somewhat chaotic drive to launch new features seems to have taken over. There's been Patreon Lens, a since discontinued attempt to mimic Snapchat's Stories feature. Merch for memberships, a print-on-demand service which allows creators to offer merchandise as perks for their supporters. Patreon Video, which enables creators to upload videos directly to Patreon rather than embedding them from YouTube or Vimeo. Not forgetting the more immediately controversial Patreon Capital, which reportedly allows larger creators to take out loans from Patreon to be paid back through a garnishing of their future earnings. Since I started writing this video, Patreon's gone even further and announced the upcoming launch of what it's calling the new Patreon. This appears to be an attempt to turn Patreon into a replacement for creators' websites and mailing lists. It will add a new, free membership tier to all creators' pages, in addition to a digital shop, which will let creators sell individual videos, podcast episodes, and more to fans who aren't necessarily signed up as regular supporters. If all this seems a little chaotic, it apparently reflects the company's culture behind the scenes. An article published in The Information earlier this year drew on interviews with over 20 current and former Patreon employees. And those interviewees painted a less than flattering portrait of Jack Conte as an incompetent and terminally disorganized CEO who is constantly jumping from one idea to the next in a manner which creates huge problems for the developers tasked with bringing his ideas to life. Nevertheless, there are some commonalities between these features. Firstly, whilst most are pitched as making life easier for creators, they actually serve to further lock creators into Patreon's ecosystem. Patreon creators are already heavily reliant on Patreon itself. Jack Conte likes to boast about the fact that creators have access to their supporters' email addresses.
You get the email addresses of your members. You can download them in a CSV and take them somewhere else.
But the reality is that for most creators, the sheer hassle of migrating to a new platform would likely lead to a considerable loss in support. These new features take this even further. Patreon previously prided itself on its interoperability, building or commissioning its own integrations for Discord, WordPress, MailChimp, and Vimeo. Features like Patreon Video and the new Patreon, however, work to replicate these services within the platform itself. Now, this might be more convenient for some creators, but it ultimately increases Patreon's hold over them. If Patreon can convince creators to replace their websites and mailing lists with its own proprietary features, it can make it much harder for them ever to move to a different platform. More important to the process of enshittification, however, is the drive to increase revenue. And in addition to further tying creators to Patreon, many of these features come with slightly sneaky additional charges. We've already discussed the manner in which Patreon's current creator plans serve to extract proportionately higher fees from more successful creators. And merch for memberships follows a similar strategy. Whilst its high costs per product might be par for the course for print-on-demand services, the scheme also requires users to hand over an additional 3% of every single penny they make through the site, regardless of how many supporters actually join tiers with merch attached. Further, whilst you might have thought that native video was a pretty standard feature for an online platform in 2023, Patreon also plans to start charging extra for that at the beginning of next year. As someone on the founder tier, all of this makes me a little suspicious about whether the new Patreon might be used as an opportunity to bring longer-term creators over onto the newer and more expensive creator plans too. Alongside unnecessary feature bloat and increased charges, however, the ultimate consequence of enshittification is the degradation of the core features which initially drew users to a platform. And Patreon's chaotic drive to build new revenue streams certainly appears to have led to a failure to maintain or improve the site's existing core functionality. That being the processing of regular payments from fans to creators. Because for most people, all of these extra features are entirely superfluous. As part of preparing for this video, I ran an, albeit entirely unscientific, poll on my YouTube community tab, which concluded that the vast majority of Patreon supporters check the site monthly or less. As one user put it, "I don't care about Patreon updates. It's just a banking website to me." But with its attention elsewhere, maintenance or development of this core functionality appears to have stalled. In August 2023, Patreon had a nightmare of a day. Firstly, an update to the platform's payment infrastructure caused a significant number of supporters to be billed from an address in Ireland rather than, as had previously been the case, California. This led those supporters' banks and credit card providers to reject those charges as fraudulent. If that wasn't bad enough, Patreon's internal systems then recorded those users as having cancelled their pledges, leading some creators to report massive losses in support. Worse still, on the very same day, a seemingly unrelated issue led Patreon to block many creators from cashing out their earnings. See, Patreon requires creators outside the US to use a service called Payoneer to retrieve the money they earn through the platform. Payoneer has always been a pretty clunky service to use, with an opaque schedule for converting payouts from US dollars into one's local currency. But a problem with how Patreon sends money to Payoneer left some creators unable to withdraw their funds at all for over 48 hours. For a lot of creators, either of these events happening would have been frustrating. For both to have happened on the same day was terrifying. On the one hand, rejected payments were causing them to lose supporters, whilst on the other, problems with Payoneer made the money from the transactions which had gone through impossible to get hold of. Over on the platform formerly known as Twitter, creators and their fans directed a justifiable amount of anger at Patreon. After a decade of convincing creators that it can be trusted upon to administer a portion of their income, many surely felt that the company should have built processes to ensure that either of these failures were impossible, let alone both. In a manner which tracks perfectly with Cory Doctorow's Enshittification thesis, it's hard not to come to the conclusion that all the time and effort Patreon has been spending developing questionable new features to increase their revenue has caused them to neglect the key service which made the site popular in the first place. Even if those features weren't so obviously designed to extract more cash from creators, many users would still not care about them, continuing to view Patreon solely as a regular digital tip jar. But if a desperate, chaotic drive to increase revenue for investors leads that primary function to fail, then it's only likely to hasten the platform's demise, not save it. At the end of the day, this is a question of priorities. Patreon has always tried to set itself apart from other platforms, particularly using the fact that it was started by a genuine creator to suggest that it always has creators' best interests at heart. The Patreon PR team must have been over the moon when a 2021 interview with Jack Conte for The Verge was headlined, "Patreon CEO Jack Conte on why creators can't depend on platforms." But the company's recent trajectory serves as a reminder that Patreon itself is a Silicon Valley platform company, which, partly as a result of loading itself up on venture capital money, has found itself forced to engage in practices identical to those of other platform companies. There may still be plenty of Patreon staff who care deeply about creators and creativity, but by desire or necessity, the company as a whole has come to treat them primarily as vectors of revenue to be maximized. I hope, for the sake of creators who rely on it, that Patreon, or something like it, can be salvaged. Because I love Patreon's core mission. Whilst my own income through Patreon has always been fairly small, having some revenue which isn't tied to sponsorships or viewership has allowed me to make much bigger risks in the topics that I cover than I otherwise would have been able to. The demise of Patreon would certainly make for a much more boring online landscape, with creators forced to work to lower budgets and be much more views-oriented in what they make. I sincerely hope the platform manages to re-find its way. But whether that's possible in a situation where the company is so beholden to investors remains to be seen. In fact, it's the risks of relying on third-party platforms like Patreon or YouTube which motivated me and a bunch of other creators to launch our premium streaming service, Nebula. Nebula is a creator-owned platform in which we have a collective say over which features get developed. This enables us to ensure that the platform continues to serve creators and our wonderful audiences, rather than being bent into weird shapes to suit the demands of venture capital investors. It also means we get to sponsor our own videos, as is happening here, and work on cool exclusive content too. In fact, if you're anything like me, you're a massive fan of Lindsay Ellis. And Lindsay's latest videos on The Lord of the Rings, E.T. and Guy Fieri are exclusive to Nebula, with more to come in the near future. All 3 of these videos are insightful and fun and perceptive in ways that only Lindsay is able to be. And they join a whole host of other exclusive productions from Legal, Second Thought, Wendover Productions, and many, many more. In addition to this, Nebula subscribers now also get access to Nebula classes. This includes my class, How to Research Like a PhD Student, in which over 16 lessons I share my strategies for finding good sources, for efficiently reading large amounts of material, and for taking and organising notes which will be useful for years to come. Whether you're a student, an aspiring creator, or just interested in how these videos come together, I think it's full of really useful advice for how to go about working on a large-scale research project. Making videos at the scale that we do is pretty expensive. They take huge amounts of time and kit and costume and software to bring together. So if you want to support us to keep making the best videos that we possibly can, then I would be so grateful if you'd sign up to Nebula using my personal link go.nebula.tv/Tom Nicholas. This will score you a full 40% off an annual subscription, meaning that you can access all of that exclusive video goodness for just $2.50 a month. Some of that money goes to fund even more exciting originals, while some of it comes directly back to us to support our work. That link again is go.nebula.tv/Tom Nicholas. I'll see you over on Nebula, but now time for some thank yous.
Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that it has been worthy of your time. It was a really interesting one to make, and I hope that came across in your watching of it. As ever, if you know of someone else you think might enjoy or get something out of this one, then please do consider sharing it with them. I would be super grateful for that. Now time to do some slightly ironic, maybe sheepish thank yous to the people who do support me over on Patreon and who get access to early little bits of my videos as I'm working on them, copies of scripts, weekly updates on what I'm working on, and much more. If you'd like to join those people, you can find out how to do so at patreon.com/Tom Nicholas. And if you sign up to the top tier, you'll get your name read out, as I'm about to do for Richard, for Alan Gann, for Gary, Dickon Spain, Bill Mitchell, ZC Reese, Alexander Blank, Niels Bildgaard, Sophia R, Sergio Suarez, Nicholas Jacquemart, Strange Weekend, Ricardo Fernandez de Cordoba, Richard Rapoon, Amit Singh Parahar, Gabriel Koch, Demelza, Jimmy Dunn, Christopher Cowan, Fiasco Linguini, and Sarah Morgan. Thank you so much to all of you for being signed up to my Patreon, and I'll see all of you in the next video.